Well, thank you everyone for coming to my presentation. I hope that it is a learning experience for everyone involved. This past May, I had the opportunity to go to Guatemala with a group of Kuiper students in a class called Ministering Cross-Culturally. We got to explore the country and witness multiple ministry opportunities throughout Guatemala. On this trip, I grew to love the culture and the people who lived there. The pictures that are in this presentation were taken by my brother and a few other people. I think, Britt, I have one of your pictures in here too. But after we got back from Guatemala, I learned of a new terrible social issue, a social justice issue that I had not heard about when we were in the country. And this was the issue of illegal adoption. So in my international social work class this semester, I had the opportunity to do a little bit more research and learn about what this issue was. And so I'd like to share that with you here today. I learned that children in Guatemala were taken from their homes and given to Western parents just so that adoption lawyers could make a profit. I was astonished as I read horror story after horror story of parents searching for their lost children, children being trafficked for their organs, and parents in America learning that the child that they had adopted was not legally theirs. To get a little more insight into this problem, I have a video to show you. It's a news story from 2007, I think, and which is right when this problem was really reaching a climax.
Bringing love and care to unwanted children, all riddled with pitfalls and corruption. What's the truth about international adoption? Should the world be doing more to guard the innocent? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. It's huge global business, but it's open to abuse. The lives of hundreds of thousands of children depend on it. So is enough being done to regulate international adoption? Well, this week, Guatemalan police have rescued nearly 50 infants from what they claim was an illegal adoption home. Some of them as young as 3 days old. It's feared the children have been stolen or that their parents have been coerced into handing them over. The couple who run the home say it's legitimate. More than 4,000 couples from the US alone adopt from Guatemala each year in a business worth some $200 million annually. Child theft is common in this poor Central American state, and welfare organizations say adoption laws are lax. While the baby trade appears to be on the rise, and it's happening all over the world. The greatest number of babies being adopted come from China, followed by Guatemala and Russia. There were at least 100,000 legal adoptions abroad between 1989 and 2003 from Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asian states. Spurred on by poverty and corruption, the baby trade is a lucrative business. UNICEF estimates the global trade is worth many millions of dollars annually. Prospective parents can pay anywhere between $20,000 to $40,000 per child. Figures on the baby trade are hard to come by. It's often difficult to distinguish between trafficking and legitimate adoption.
So as you can see, this problem is very widespread and it has an adverse effect on these children. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's get some of our terms straight. The words illegal adoption, child trafficking, baby trade, and adoption trafficking are all used in this presentation to describe the action of taking a child from his or her home through the use of coercion, bribery, or kidnapping in order to be put up for international adoption. Another important key term in this issue is jaladores, and that is a Spanish word for the people who search for children and do the work of coercing or kidnapping. So for example, in that video you saw the husband and wife that were being arrested for having a home with illegal adoption. Those would be known as the jaladores. And then another term is notarios, which are lawyers who oversee the adoption process. So in 2008, international adoptions were closed in Guatemala, meaning that no one could adopt a child from Guatemala unless they lived in that country. Many people were shocked to hear this news. Why would a poor country like Guatemala close its international adoptions? Isn't international adoption a good thing? Let's look at a few other facts. Until 2008, 1 in 100 children born in Guatemala were put up for adoption. Guatemala, a country of 15 million people, had the second highest number of adoptions after China, which you heard in the video. And that's not just percentage-wise, that's in sheer numbers. So when you think about the fact that China is a country of 4 billion people and Guatemala is a country of 15 million people, and you see that Guatemala had almost the same number as China, there's obviously something very wrong going on here. So as I was researching this topic, I wanted to know, well, what's the history of Guatemala that has led to this issue being so widespread? From 1960 to 1996, the country was in a civil war. This 36-year war resulted in 34,000 refugees and 1 million internally displaced persons, more than half of whom were children. Many children were taken by the Guatemalan army and put in orphanages as a way to quell the rebels. And by 1996, the country was ravaged by war and full of orphans. There were too many to even consider attempting to find their birth parents, and most of them were probably already dead. In this picture, if you can see, it's of a person who died in one of the massacres, and we saw a lot of cemeteries and things that had a lot of people who died in that war. So what to do with all these orphans? Americans started adopting them left and right. Between 1998 and 2008, U.S. citizens adopted 30,000 Guatemalan children. And that was when it started to become an industry. Before international adoptions were closed in 2008, attorneys, which we learned are called notarios, could oversee both sides of the adoption process. So they could witness a birth mother signing away the rights to her child, and they could assign that same child to a foreign family for adoption, for a sizable fee, of course. 98% of adoptions went through these notarios, and they could oversee this process and charge extreme fees without any accountability from the legal system or social service agencies. By 2008, these notarios were charging $35,000 per child, which is an astronomical fee, especially when compared to the average income and cost of living in Guatemala. And then if you compare that with what the cost of living is here in the United States, it's like charging $350,000 per child, and all of that money was going straight into the pockets of the lawyers. All the while, the children who truly needed to be adopted, but they were either too old or had a disability, they were stuck in the orphanages because these lawyers were looking for the cute children that people would want to adopt. There was some suspicion of Guatemala's substandard adoption practices, but nothing was done about it until the Hague Conference in 2002. In 2002, the Hague Conference, which is an organization that writes international law, penned the Hague Convention on Inter-Country Adoption. The goal of the convention was to end adoption trafficking. It sought to protect children and ensure that adoptions were completed with the best interests of the child. Guatemala ratified the convention, implying that the country was ready to stand by those standards and uphold them. However, many countries like France, Germany, and Switzerland objected to Guatemala signing the treaty because they had suspicions that Guatemala was not really up to code. So Guatemalan legislators then tried to adjust its adoption policies to comply with the Hague Convention. Predictably, the Guatemalan lawyers who were making all this money really objected to making those changes because they knew that if those policies were changed, they would no longer have control of the system. meaning they could no longer make tens of thousands of dollars on every child that they were getting adopted out of the country. So the Guatemalan legislators started out wanting to do the right thing, and they caught themselves between international pressure and internal pressure. And eventually, the internal pressure won out. So the Guatemalan Constitutional Court overturned the Hague ratification. And they went back to their unhealthy practices of adoption. The countries that objected to Guatemala's signing of this convention stopped doing adoption with Guatemala, and this was all in 2002, 2003, but the United States continued to do adoption with Guatemala until 2008 because they didn't ratify the convention until then, which I think is very interesting, and I didn't get to do any research into that. But that's something that the United States also needs to work on then in their own system. So in addition to learning about the history of Guatemala and the history of illegal adoption in the country, I wanted to know what the culture of Guatemala was like. Specifically, I wanted to know why people in Guatemala then do not adopt orphans, because now that adoptions are closed, the orphans in Guatemala can only be adopted by people who live in Guatemala, but only a small portion of those children actually get adopted. So now the orphanages are just filling up with children. So then I landed on the cultural idea that kind of keeps adoption at bay, and it is machismo. Machismo is the idea that the better man is the one who can drink the most, sire the most sons, defend himself the most, dominate his wife, and command the absolute respect of his children. Machismo creates men who dominate women and women who accept that domination as part of their culture. I read about a study that surveyed Guatemalan college students on their attitudes towards machismo, gender roles, and adoption. And overall, the study concluded that the attitudes toward adoption in Guatemala depend on men and women's views of gender roles in society. So women are really accepting of adoption, and they think it's a good idea. In Guatemalan culture, it's a mandate for women to be nurturing, to have children, to be a mother, and so they like the idea of accepting more children into their home. However, men are more in the idea of, with this whole machismo idea of siring sons and having respect of his children, they're not really into that idea of taking another person into their home if that wasn't their child. And then also the fact that this machismo idea is accepted by men and women kind of means that the men's idea wins out over the women's beliefs, and so that prevents adoption from happening. So it's also good to learn about the economy of Guatemala. 54% of the population of Guatemala lives in poverty, and 13% live in extreme poverty. Their main business in Guatemala is agriculture. So they export coffee, sugar, bananas, and vegetables. Those are their key exports. And this being so, much of the population of Guatemala live in rural areas and make their living from agriculture. Agricultural workers, however, do not make a lot of money from their work. And with so many people living in poverty, it is hard to take care of children, and it is unheard of to adopt. Families who might be able to make some extra money by giving up their children to be given up for adoption take the opportunity. In addition, economically speaking, child trafficking is a lucrative business in Guatemala. The economic rewards involved in child trafficking are very large, comparable with arms and drugs. So there's a lot of money at stake and big profits to be made, which is a huge incentive for organized crime networks. So it's all kind of intertwined with the drugs and the human trafficking and all of this stuff going on in Guatemala. And sadly, so we have these parents who sell their kids because they don't have enough money. We have these people who traffic the kids because it's a lucrative business. And then we have parents whose children are kidnapped or coerced away from them. And because they're poor, they have few resources to track their children when they're taken from them. And in addition, Guatemala's weak police system creates an atmosphere where kidnappers get away with their crimes. And I mean, if we're being real here, you can pay off the policemen and they won't. The people who have money are the ones trafficking the kids, and they can easily just pay off the policemen from investigating. So it's just really, really corrupt. In addition, it's also another thing that contributes to this problem, or is interacting with this problem, is the religion in this country. 50 to 60% of the people in Guatemala say that they are Catholic, while 40% of the population say they are Protestant. So if I know anything about Christianity, I know that adoption is a symbol of Christ and what he does for us. And the Catholic Church is very supportive of adoption. They even have St. Jerome, who's pictured here, who is the patron saint of abandoned children and orphans. And in addition, from a non-Catholic perspective, theologian Russell Moore points out in his book, Adopted for Life, that adoption is not just about couples who want children or who want more children. Adoption is about an entire culture, and within our churches, a culture that sees adoption as part of our Great Commission mandate and as a sign of the gospel itself. Moore encourages Christians to adopt because it is a calling of those who have been adopted into the family of Christ to adopt others into our earthly families. So, if Christianity is pro-adoption, and nearly 100% of the population claims Christianity as their religion, how come adoption is not a huge part of Guatemalan culture and practice? Well, most Guatemalans are nominal in their practice, and adoption is just not something that's preached in their churches. And that's just kind of the sad truth of it. But now, we've kind of covered all of these things, but as I did my research, I thought about what are some solutions to this problem. The first and foremost is revise the laws, because making legislation really does have an effect. So this would involve making sure that the adoption process does comply with the Hague Convention, and encouraging the lawmakers in Guatemala to make those changes. Along with revising the laws, it's important to license agencies so that we have licensed people who know what they're doing and have to comply by the rules in order to continue doing adoption. So they need to have a license in order to do that, which would take away the power of the notarios from just doing everything themselves and having their own private adoption business. In Michigan, we have DHS, for example, that regulates adoption. So there are plenty of models that Guatemala can look at to develop this legislation. In addition, the PowerPoint, I'm sorry, the words are behind the picture, but that's supposed to say facilitate family support and strengthening. We learned in our international social work class a little bit more about international adoption and what we can do to help the issue, and that is to help families become sufficient on their own. So these families who are poor and who need resources, and so they either give up their children or their children are taken from them because they're just a vulnerable population. If we help those families to become self-sufficient, that can help in this problem a lot, so they don't have to resort to selling their children for adoption. When we went to Guatemala, we got to meet Rob and Tara Cahill, who do some of this type of work. They have helped a few communities in some rural parts of Guatemala and helped them to become self-sufficient. They have helped them learn better agricultural practices so that their crops are actually fertile and fruitful and they can make money from that. They have also encouraged them to send their children to school, especially girls, because when we learned that, I mean, this is a whole other issue, but sending girls to school keeps them from getting married young and having a lot of kids, and It helps them have a say in how the family is run and all kinds of things that's really positive for society. And so they have encouraged them to keep girls in school. And which leads me into my next point, which is providing education. This is a huge one. Currently, the average schooling for children in Guatemala is 4 years. And for every 10 children that enter the school system, only 4 graduate from primary school and only 1 graduates from secondary school. Often children are needed at home to help keep the family out of poverty. However, like I said earlier, this means that girls get married young and have lots of children, and that there are exponentially more mouths to feed, and it means that the cycle of poverty spirals down further and further. However, creating incentives for families to keep their children in school will lessen this cycle of poverty and family growth. In Mexico, there's a program known as Oportunidades, which gives families incentives for keeping their children in school. For example, basic health care and nutritional supplements are given to families who send their children to school up to a certain point. The longer the child stays in school, the longer and better the incentives become. This would theoretically cause families to be less desperate to sell their children for money, and it will keep boys off the streets and out of gangs and organized crime where much illegal trafficking is facilitated. This project has opened my eyes to the gruesome trade of children in Guatemala. This presentation hardly touches on some of the horror stories, but it makes my heart break, and I really want to do what I can to help this issue. I also have a personal stake in this issue. Somebody very close to me is an orphan who is from Guatemala, but he is here on an education visa as a foster child living with his family. But he cannot be adopted by his foster parents. When he graduates high school, he's going to have to go back to Guatemala. But I hope that this story or that this presentation and raising awareness about this issue can help Guatemala to better their adoption system so that children can be adopted, and so that they can find true families that love them, whether that's in Guatemala or outside of Guatemala. It is my prayer that Christians hear the call to adopt and to advocate for the voiceless. We can raise awareness of this issue and write letters to Guatemalan legislators to get a move on. So I leave you with a Bible verse that is motivating to me in regards to this issue. It is Matthew 18:5, where Jesus says to his followers, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me."